April 10, 2023, dawned like any other day in the small town of Westfield, Ohio, where community and tradition held a firm grip on everyday life. But by mid-morning, whispers had spread like wildfire. A body had been found. Not just any body, but that of Lucia Harper, a young, well-known wife and mother of two. Her name alone brought shock. Lucia had been cherished in the community, a fixture at Sunday services, always at her children's school events, a face everyone recognized. The scene itself, tucked away in a secluded field on the outskirts of town, was an image straight out of a nightmare. A local farmer, Franklin Miller, had stumbled upon her while checking his fences. He saw her lying motionless, face down in the dirt, her once vibrant life reduced to a haunting silence. Franklin, though a man of strong character, couldn't shake the horror as he shakily dialed the police. By the time officers arrived, the quiet fields buzzed with urgency. Yellow tape cordoned off the area, and forensic teams examined every inch of the surroundings. As the body was carefully moved, one officer noticed something disturbing: the faint marks around her neck, clear indications that Lucia's life had been taken violently. This wasn't a tragic accident or unfortunate coincidence. It was something darker, and the weight of it pressed on every officer on the scene. Detective Sarah Lawson, known for her tenacity in the small Westfield precinct, took charge of the investigation. Standing at the scene, she looked around, piecing together fragments of a story only Lucia's lifeless body could tell. How had someone like Lucia ended up here, in such a desolate place, with no one around to hear her last moments? The questions lingered in the spring air as Sarah steeled herself to find answers. Word of Lucia's death spread through Westfield faster than the morning coffee poured at the local diner. Conversations hushed, glances exchanged. Lucia had been a beloved figure, a woman with a reputation as solid as the town's century-old chapel. To imagine her life ending in such a brutal way was unfathomable. Rumors swirled, each one more lurid than the last. Some whispered of a troubled marriage, others of dark secrets hidden behind her serene smile. No one, it seemed, was ready to believe that a woman like Lucia could fall victim to such a horrific end. But for Detective Lawson, this case was already unlike any she had seen. The strangeness of the location, the signs of a struggle, and, most chillingly, the mark of someone's hands on Lucia's neck hinted at something far beyond the routine cases she'd handled. She was certain that whoever had done this hadn't intended for Lucia's body to be found so quickly, or perhaps, not at all. As the day wore on, media vans began lining the outskirts of the field, reporters eager to catch any detail, any glimpse into what had happened to Westfield's beloved Lucia Harper. The quiet town was now thrust into the glare of the public eye, and the peaceful veneer that had defined Westfield started to crack. Lucia Harper had long been the picture of a perfect wife and mother in Westfield. To anyone watching, her life appeared like a well-rehearsed scene, a loving marriage, two beautiful children, and a strong presence in the community. But what the town saw was only a fragment of Lucia's world, an illusion that she worked hard to maintain. Inside, her life told a different story, one woven with threads of loneliness and frustration. Lucia had met David Harper over a decade ago, when they were both young and full of dreams. He was charming, driven, and seemed to promise a life of excitement and security. They married within 2 years, bought a modest home in Westfield, and began a family. David's dedication to providing for them was undeniable, but his ambitious career in finance soon became all-consuming. Over time, his work hours grew longer, his absences more frequent, and his conversations with Lucia, once filled with shared dreams, became little more than functional exchanges about bills and the kids' schedules. With David's career successes came distance. The demands of his job drained him, and he returned home every night exhausted, with barely enough energy to ask about her day. Lucia found herself filling the gaps, managing the household and caring for their children alone, longing for his attention. She wore her loneliness like a second skin, feeling more like a shadow in her own home than a valued partner. Every day, she would prepare his meals, keep the house in order, and ensure their children thrived, yet an emptiness grew within her, a hollow ache that became harder to ignore. The Harper children, lively and full of energy, were her pride and joy, yet even their laughter couldn't fill the silence that David left behind. Lucia yearned for companionship, a confidant, someone who could see her, listen to her, truly understand her. This longing wasn't just about the absence of her husband, it was about something deeper, a desire to be seen and valued beyond her roles as a mother and wife. The community's admiration of her dedication only highlighted her private isolation, making the gulf between her and David feel wider with every passing day. It was in this vulnerable state that Father Gabriel Monroe entered her life. Father Gabriel had come to Westfield a few years earlier and quickly gained the respect and trust of the congregation. With a calming presence and a kind smile, he was someone who seemed to genuinely care about the lives of those he served. Gabriel had a way of connecting with people, a natural empathy that made them feel understood. To Lucia, he was more than just a priest, he was a friend, a figure of support in a world that felt increasingly cold. Their connection began innocently, during community gatherings and Sunday services. He noticed her sadness, her distance, and inquired with a genuine kindness that Lucia hadn't felt in years. They started to share conversations after services, brief exchanges that quickly grew into something deeper. Gabriel would ask about her well-being, gently probing into the thoughts she kept hidden from everyone else. She, in turn, found herself confiding in him, sharing the parts of her life she had buried even from herself. Those first conversations were liberating for Lucia. Here was someone who saw beyond the surface, who asked questions that made her feel like she mattered as a person, not just as David's wife or the Harper children's mother. Gabriel listened, his attention undivided, his gaze comforting. In him, she found the kindness she had longed for, the understanding she had been denied. What began as innocent talks grew into more frequent meetings, private moments in Gabriel's office where they could both forget the weight of their roles. For Gabriel, too, these exchanges held meaning. He felt drawn to Lucia's vulnerability, her raw honesty, and her unspoken need for validation. Despite his vows, he couldn't help but feel a spark, a dangerous warmth that built every time they met. As spring turned to summer, the boundaries of their relationship became more blurred. The intensity of their connection, the thrill of secret companionship, filled the void that had long haunted both of them. But they remained cautious, knowing the line they were approaching, and knowing that if they crossed it, there would be no going back. In Westfield, appearances were everything. But for Lucia and Gabriel, their growing connection threatened to unravel the very fabric of their lives. As summer deepened in Westfield, the boundary between Lucia and Father Gabriel's roles grew increasingly blurred. What began as solace in quiet conversations was now laced with longing glances, unspoken desires, and the thrill of secrecy. Both knew they were dangerously close to crossing a line, yet the allure of connection in a world where they each felt isolated proved too powerful to resist. One evening in late August, a storm rolled over the town, filling the air with the scent of rain and electricity. After a tense argument with David, Lucia found herself driving to the church, needing sanctuary from the loneliness that had become her life. She entered, seeking peace in the familiar warmth of the chapel, but soon noticed Gabriel's office light flickering from down the hall. Drawn to it, she approached, knowing he would be there, the one person who seemed to understand her turmoil. Gabriel welcomed her in, his gentle smile a stark contrast to the tempest raging outside. As she poured out her frustrations, her fears, her feelings of insignificance, Gabriel listened, his calm presence grounding her. The storm outside became a backdrop to her own storm within. When her voice finally broke and she looked at him, tears in her eyes, Gabriel reached out instinctively, brushing her cheek. The tenderness of that touch, so simple yet charged with meaning, was enough to shatter the dam they'd both been holding. Without a word, Lucia leaned in, and Gabriel met her halfway. Their first kiss was hesitant but filled with longing, both electrified by the forbidden nature of the act. They pulled away briefly, their breaths shallow, gazes locked in mutual understanding of what they had just begun. In that moment, all restraint vanished. The rules that had governed their lives melted away, leaving only the raw, undeniable connection between them. Each knew that this was a turning point, that their lives would be forever altered, yet neither could stop. Over the following weeks, they met in secret, stolen moments that breathed life into both of them. The church became their sanctuary, its quiet corners and darkened hallways witnesses to their clandestine meetings. Every encounter held an intensity neither had known before, a powerful escape from the restrictions that had defined their lives. For Gabriel, the pull was as much spiritual as it was emotional. His vows, once a bedrock of his identity, began to feel like a prison. He convinced himself that what he felt for Lucia was different, a connection that transcended the confines of duty and morality. Lucia, too, found herself irrevocably drawn to Gabriel. In him, she found not just comfort, but validation and desire. For the first time in years, she felt alive, seen, and valued as a person, not merely a mother or wife bound by the duties of her marriage. In their hidden moments together, she experienced an exhilarating freedom, a sense of being understood without judgment or expectation. Each meeting was a rebellion against the emptiness that had consumed her life, and she relished the thrill of it all. Their relationship, however, came with an undercurrent of tension. Every glance shared in public was tinged with the risk of discovery, every whispered word cloaked in caution. Westfield was a small town, secrets didn't stay hidden for long, and both knew that exposure would bring ruin not only to themselves but to everyone connected to them. Gabriel's position as a priest amplified the stakes. A scandal would shatter his life and devastate the parishioners who trusted him. For Lucia, the cost would be her family, her children, her entire existence. Yet these very risks only heightened the thrill, adding a sense of urgency to every encounter. Despite the danger, they couldn't turn away from each other. Their secret became a lifeline, an escape from the constraints of their lives. For Gabriel, the weight of his collar became heavier with each meeting, yet the thought of ending their relationship seemed unthinkable. Lucia, too, found herself questioning her choices but felt powerless to stop. Their affair had woven itself into their lives so completely that they could no longer imagine being without it. As autumn approached, their passion showed no signs of cooling, but the shadows of their actions grew longer, casting doubt over their stolen happiness. They were both living on borrowed time, and deep down, they sensed that something had to give. But in the intoxicating rush of their love, neither wanted to face what lay ahead. Instead, they clung to each other, blind to the consequences lurking in the background, certain only of the desire that bound them. As the first chill of autumn settled over Westfield, Lucia Harper noticed subtle but unmistakable changes within herself. She dismissed the waves of nausea as nothing at first, blaming stress and lack of sleep. But when her clothes began to feel tighter, and exhaustion became her constant companion, a nagging suspicion crept into her mind. Avoiding the truth felt safer, yet the signs were undeniable. After weeks of denial, Lucia bought a pregnancy test, her hands trembling as she opened the box. A minute later, her worst fears were confirmed. 2 lines appeared on the test, a clear, unmistakable answer. Lucia's heart pounded as the reality set in. She sat alone in the bathroom, staring at the test, overwhelmed by a whirlwind of emotions. Her first thoughts turned to David, her husband. How would she explain this to him? Their marriage had grown cold, their intimacy almost non-existent. She knew with certainty that this child could not be his. But the implications of this truth were terrifying, unraveling the precarious balance of her life. She thought of Gabriel, the man she had come to love and who had become the father of this child, however impossibly. For a fleeting moment, a warm hope blossomed within her, perhaps this was a sign, a reason for them to start a life together. But as the days wore on, the warmth of hope began to fade, replaced by an unsettling dread. Lucia's heart ached, knowing she would have to tell Gabriel. She arranged to meet him at the church after hours, when the building was empty and no prying eyes could observe their conversation. Sitting in his office, she struggled to find the right words. She wanted him to feel the joy she had felt, however brief, to see this child as a miracle rather than a mistake. Yet as soon as she revealed her pregnancy, Gabriel's reaction shattered her. Gabriel's face drained of color as the words left her lips. For a moment, he said nothing, only stared at her, his expression shifting from shock to horror. "Lucia," he finally whispered, barely able to form the words, this can't happen." His voice, once so full of comfort, now felt cold, edged with panic. "You have to get rid of it," he said, his tone flat, the warmth she had always found in him replaced by a chilling pragmatism. The harshness of his response hit her like a blow. She had expected fear, perhaps, but not this complete rejection. Lucia's heart sank as she looked into his eyes, searching for even a flicker of compassion. But Gabriel's resolve was unyielding. He spoke quickly, his voice rising in desperation as he listed the consequences they would both face if the truth came out. His position, his reputation, everything he had built would be destroyed, and the scandal would leave their lives in ruins. Gabriel painted a bleak picture, one where the child was nothing more than a threat, a risk they couldn't afford to take. His words felt calculated, devoid of any acknowledgement of the life they had created together. At first, Lucia resisted, clinging to the fragile hope that Gabriel might change his mind. But his determination was unwavering, his pressure relentless. Every meeting, every conversation returned to the same conclusion: the child had to be taken care of, and the sooner, the better. Gabriel rationalized his demands, reminding her of the community's expectations, of the moral judgment they would face. Each word from him chipped away at her resolve, her once shining hope dimming under the weight of his insistence. In moments alone, Lucia wrestled with the idea of the abortion. She felt trapped between her own desires and the unyielding pressure from the man who had once made her feel seen and valued. The thought of ending her pregnancy filled her with sorrow, but the alternative, defying Gabriel, risking everything they had built in secret, seemed even more terrifying. The more he pressured her, the more she felt her own strength slipping away. Finally, after weeks of relentless persuasion and emotional exhaustion, Lucia agreed to the procedure. She tried to tell herself it was the only way, the decision that would protect them both. But as she drove herself to the clinic on the outskirts of town, with Gabriel silent beside her, a heavy emptiness settled over her. Gabriel waited outside while she went in alone, the cold sterility of the clinic a stark reminder of the life she was about to leave behind. The procedure was swift, but each second felt like an eternity. When it was over, she emerged feeling hollow, the weight of loss settling into her bones. As they drove back to Westfield in silence, Lucia looked out the window, her heart filled with a sorrow that words could not express. She had sacrificed the child she had briefly dared to imagine, all for the sake of a man who had once promised her comfort but had instead demanded obedience. After the abortion, Lucia felt an emptiness unlike anything she had ever known. The procedure was over in moments, but the weight of what she had done settled deeply into her bones, heavy and unshakable. As she sat in the passenger seat on the drive back to Westfield, her gaze fixed on the darkening horizon, she felt detached, as though part of her had been left behind in that cold, sterile clinic. Gabriel drove in silence, his focus on the road ahead, oblivious to the turmoil churning inside her. Not once did he reach for her hand, offer a word of comfort, or even acknowledge the monumental loss she had just endured. The days following the abortion passed in a hazy blur. Every morning, Lucia went through the motions, preparing breakfast, getting the children ready for school, tidying up the house, but her mind felt distant, caught in a fog of regret and sorrow. Simple tasks that had once grounded her now felt meaningless, each action a reminder of the child she would never meet, the future she had allowed to slip through her fingers. The emptiness inside her grew, a hollow ache that refused to fade, gnawing away at the edges of her sanity. Her interactions with Gabriel, once a source of comfort, became a torment. Each time she saw him, she was reminded of his cold insistence, the relentless pressure he had placed upon her to terminate the pregnancy. His visits to her were fewer now, the once frequent secret meetings becoming brief exchanges devoid of the warmth they once held. Gabriel had seemed to move on, treating the incident as a closed chapter, an inconvenience best left unspoken. But for Lucia, it was a wound that refused to heal, a scar that grew deeper with each passing day. Sleep became a fleeting luxury. Lucia lay awake night after night, her mind haunted by images of what could have been. She imagined herself holding a baby, rocking it to sleep, seeing her own eyes mirrored in the tiny face. In her darkest moments, she would close her eyes and feel the phantom weight of a child in her arms, only to open them and be met with the crushing emptiness of reality. She would sometimes press her hand to her stomach, as if hoping to feel a heartbeat that was no longer there, a painful reminder of what she had lost. Lucia's interactions with her family grew strained. David, oblivious to the depths of her despair, noticed her distant behavior and questioned her about it, but she dismissed his concerns, too exhausted to fabricate explanations. Her children, too, sensed the change, their laughter and affection met with a vacant stare or a half-hearted smile. Even their touch, once a source of joy, felt like a reminder of the life she had willingly given up. She was living in a prison of her own making, each day a painful echo of the decision she had been forced to make. Gabriel, meanwhile, resumed his role in the community, seemingly unburdened by the events that had left Lucia hollow. His sermons continued, his words of comfort to others delivered with the same conviction that had once captivated her. But to Lucia, his presence felt like an accusation, his voice a chilling reminder of the coldness with which he had dismissed her pain. Each Sunday, she watched him on the pulpit, her mind filled with bitter questions. How could he speak of love and forgiveness when he had denied her both? How could he continue preaching with a heart so hardened? The weight of her silence grew unbearable. She longed to speak, to unburden herself, but the shame and guilt kept her silent. In her mind, she replayed Gabriel's warnings about the consequences of revealing the truth, his threats of scandal and ruin. She had sacrificed everything for him, and in return, he had left her to bear the burden alone. It was a betrayal that festered within her, a poison that seeped into every part of her life. She could feel herself slipping away, her identity eroding under the weight of what she had done and the love she had lost. One cold evening, as she sat alone in the darkened living room, Lucia felt a wave of despair wash over her. She stared at the family photos on the wall, images of happier times, moments when life felt whole. But now, those images felt like fragments of a life that belonged to someone else, a woman who no longer existed. She could barely recognize herself, her reflection in the mirror a hollow echo of the person she had once been. In those quiet hours of the night, Lucia began to realize that the cost of her silence was far greater than she had imagined. She had lost not only her child but also her sense of self, her spirit, her reason for being. Every sacrifice she had made, every secret she had kept, felt like an unbearable weight pressing down on her soul. And in that darkness, a seed of resolve began to grow within her. She could not keep living this way, imprisoned by regret and haunted by the choices she had made for the sake of a man who no longer seemed to care. Lucia Harper felt as if she was living in the eye of a storm. On the surface, her days continued with the semblance of normalcy, caring for her children, greeting neighbors, attending church with David. But within, she was drowning, torn between the life she portrayed to the world and the shattered pieces of herself she hid away. The abortion, Gabriel's cold insistence, and her silent suffering gnawed at her relentlessly, leaving her with an emptiness so profound it was as though her very soul had been hollowed out. She couldn't look at David without feeling a rush of guilt, his kind gestures and patient demeanor reminders of the secrets she kept from him. His attempts to bridge the distance between them, though well-intentioned, fell flat, unable to touch the depths of sorrow and betrayal that consumed her. With every passing day, it became harder to wear the mask she presented to the world. Lucia was slowly unraveling, and she knew that soon, the truth she held within her would demand to be set free. Lucia's relationship with Father Gabriel had changed irreversibly. Every time she saw him, every glance they exchanged, only amplified the betrayal she felt. She had once viewed him as her sanctuary, a place of comfort and understanding. But now, he was a symbol of the darkest choices she had made, the man who had led her down a path she could no longer endure. Each Sunday as he preached, his voice calm and commanding, she was reminded of the coldness he had shown her, the way he had pushed her to abandon her child, to silence her grief. His words, once soothing, now rang hollow, dripping with hypocrisy. A deep resentment simmered within her, mixing with the shame and anger she felt toward herself. She began questioning everything, the choices she had made, the feelings she had once thought of as love, and most of all, the trust she had placed in Gabriel. What had once felt like a precious, forbidden connection now appeared as manipulation, a betrayal wrapped in sweet words and false promises. She could no longer bear the weight of her secrets, and the desire to reclaim her life, to confront her mistakes, grew stronger with each passing day. One night, as she sat alone in the dim light of her living room, Lucia reached a breaking point. The silence of her home felt suffocating, the walls closing in, pressing down on her with the weight of everything left unspoken. She remembered the moments she had once shared with Gabriel, the warmth that had once filled her heart now replaced by a raw, bitter anger. How had she allowed herself to be swept so far from the person she once was? How had she let Gabriel dictate the course of her life, her choices, her future? The questions stirred within her, unrelenting, until finally, she felt a spark ignite. She knew that she could not continue to live with this burden, this suffocating silence. She wanted freedom from the guilt, from the lies, from the life she had built on falsehoods and betrayals. She wanted the truth, her truth, to come to light, no matter the consequences. A fierce determination took hold of her, a resolve that pushed aside the fears that had held her captive for so long. The next morning, Lucia confronted Gabriel. She waited until after the morning service, catching him in the quiet of the church office, away from prying eyes. Her face, once softened by love and trust, was now set with steely resolve. She looked at him, and he immediately sensed the change, the determination in her gaze. "Gabriel," she began, her voice calm yet unyielding, "I can't keep doing this. I can't keep hiding in the shadows, pretending that none of this happened." Her words were a declaration, filled with the strength she hadn't felt in months. "I'm going to tell the congregation everything, the affair, the abortion, all of it. I can't live with this lie anymore." Gabriel's face paled, and he quickly moved to close the office door, his voice hushed but frantic. "Lucia, you don't understand what you're saying. This isn't just about you, it's about the parish, the people who trust me. Do you want to destroy everything we've both worked for?" But Lucia held firm. "I'm done sacrificing my soul for the sake of keeping your secrets. I was willing to do anything for you once, Gabriel. But I can't live with myself if I keep hiding the truth." Desperation flickered in his eyes, a glint of panic breaking through his composed exterior. He pleaded with her, his voice thick with fear, but Lucia remained resolute, immune to his once convincing words. She could see his desperation, his selfishness, and the fear that had motivated him all along. For the first time, she felt free from his hold, from the charm he had once wielded so effortlessly. Their confrontation ended with an ultimatum. Lucia would no longer be silent. The truth she had kept hidden for so long would finally see the light, regardless of the cost. And as she left the church that morning, her steps lighter than they had been in months, she knew that her decision, though dangerous, was the only path forward. As the chill of autumn settled over Westfield, the tension between Lucia and Gabriel simmered, each encounter more volatile than the last. Lucia's decision to reveal the truth about their affair and the abortion had shaken Gabriel to his core. His desperation grew with each passing day, gnawing at him as he struggled to maintain his composure in his role as the town's beloved priest. Every sermon, every glance from the congregation, every whispered confession felt like a reminder of the secret that loomed over him, threatening to destroy his carefully constructed life. Lucia, on the other hand, felt an unusual calm, a clarity she hadn't experienced in months. She knew that her decision would come at a cost, that it would shatter her life, her family, and the trust the community had placed in her. But she had spent too long being silenced, her guilt and sorrow buried beneath Gabriel's demands. The burden had become too great to bear, and now, with her mind made up, she felt resolute, even empowered. She had decided that her life would no longer be defined by secrecy and shame. On a stormy October evening, as rain lashed against the windows of her home, Lucia prepared herself to attend the evening service. She had arranged to meet Gabriel afterward, certain that their conversation would be one of finality. She had given him ample time to accept her decision, to find peace with the truth. But she could see his fear, his panic, growing with each confrontation. Gabriel's desperate pleas and subtle threats had failed to sway her, and she knew tonight would be the last time they would meet before she confessed everything to the congregation. As she arrived at the church, the air felt heavy, thick with tension and the smell of rain-soaked earth. The usually inviting warmth of the chapel was overshadowed by a haunting stillness. The service concluded with the usual solemnity, but Lucia felt the weight of Gabriel's gaze on her as he preached, his voice strained as he delivered his message. She could feel his anger simmering beneath the surface, an unspoken fury barely restrained by the rituals of his role. After the congregation had left, Lucia lingered, waiting until the church was empty before she made her way to Gabriel's office. He was there, standing by the window, his figure silhouetted against the faint glow of the streetlights outside. She closed the door behind her, the quiet click echoing in the silence between them. Gabriel turned to face her, his expression one of exhaustion and barely contained rage. "Lucia," he said, his voice low and cold, "I need you to reconsider. For the sake of everything we've been through, for your family, for your children. You can't do this." But Lucia held her ground, meeting his gaze with a calm determination. "It's already done, Gabriel," she replied, her tone unwavering. "I've spent too long hiding, and I refuse to live under this shadow any longer. This ends here." Gabriel's composure fractured. His face twisted with a mixture of fear and fury as he took a step toward her, his eyes blazing with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. "You think you can just walk away from this? You're willing to destroy everything, my life, your family's life, just to satisfy some need for absolution." Lucia felt her own anger rise, a fierce defiance that had been long suppressed. "I am done sacrificing myself for you," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "You used me, you pushed me to choices I can never undo, and now you want me to live with this guilt while you go on pretending to be a man of God?" In that moment, something in Gabriel snapped. His face hardened, his expression darkening as he took another step toward her. "You have no idea what you're risking, Lucia. You're going to ruin us both." But Lucia refused to be intimidated. She stood her ground, staring at him with unflinching resolve. "If that's what it takes, then so be it." The silence that followed was charged, a deadly calm settling between them. Gabriel's breath quickened, his fists clenching as he struggled to maintain control. But in his mind, he saw his entire world crumbling, his position, his respect, the very life he had built slipping through his fingers. Desperation clouded his thoughts, his mind twisting with a single, unyielding impulse, to stop Lucia, no matter the cost. Without warning, Gabriel lunged forward, his hand wrapping around her throat in a vice-like grip. Lucia's eyes widened in shock, her hands clawing at his, but his grip only tightened as he pressed her back against the wall. The room seemed to close in around them, the shadows deepening as the sound of the rain outside grew louder, muffling her gasps and the frantic scuffling of their struggle. Lucia fought with all her strength, her vision blurring as the air left her lungs. She saw his face, contorted with rage and desperation, the man she had once trusted now transformed into a stranger. Her strength waned, her body weakening under his relentless hold, until finally, her struggle ceased. Her hands fell limp, her gaze unfocused, and the room returned to an eerie stillness. Gabriel released her, stepping back and watching as her lifeless form crumpled to the floor. His chest heaved as he stared down at her, the reality of what he had done settling over him like a weight he could never lift. For a moment, he was frozen, his mind racing with fear and disbelief. But then, the instincts of self-preservation kicked in. He had to cover his tracks, make sure that no one would ever know what had transpired between them. In a daze, Gabriel lifted Lucia's body, his hands trembling as he carried her through the empty church. The storm outside provided cover as he moved, the rain erasing any trace of his movements. He drove through the deserted streets to the outskirts of town, to a field hidden from prying eyes. There, under the cover of darkness and pounding rain, he left her, her body a grim testament to the secrets they had shared and the ruinous consequences they had brought. As he returned to Westfield, Gabriel felt a strange calm settle over him, a sense of grim finality. He had silenced Lucia, erased the threat she posed to his life. But as he entered the quiet stillness of the town once more, he couldn't escape the knowledge that her absence, like the shadow of their sins, would haunt him forever. The morning after the storm, as dawn broke over Westfield, the rain had left the town soaked and gray. In the early light, Franklin Miller, a local farmer, ventured out to check his fields. As he trudged through the muddy terrain, his eyes caught something unusual in the distance, a shape lying still against the ground. He stopped, squinting against the mist that clung to the morning air, and felt a chill ripple down his spine. Something was wrong. As he approached, Franklin's stomach tightened. There, face down in the muddy grass, lay the lifeless body of Lucia Harper. Her hair, damp from the rain, was strewn across her shoulders, and her clothes clung to her as if she had been abandoned in haste. The sight was unsettling. Lucia, a familiar face in Westfield, who everyone knew as a devoted mother and wife, now lay silent and cold on the ground. Franklin's hands trembled as he pulled out his phone to dial the police. The call mobilized the entire Westfield police force, and soon, Detective Sarah Lawson, one of the precinct's most experienced investigators, arrived on the scene. She was a seasoned detective with a reputation for solving complex cases, but as she looked down at Lucia's body, she felt an unexplainable pang of sadness. This was a woman the town knew, someone who had always seemed so much a part of the fabric of their community. How had she ended up here, alone and abandoned? The forensics team began their meticulous work, cordoning off the area, snapping photos, and collecting samples. Detective Lawson noticed something right away. There were faint bruises around Lucia's neck, telltale signs of strangulation. This was no accident. Lucia's death was deliberate, and the bruises suggested that whoever had taken her life had been close, intimate even. The thought made Detective Lawson's stomach turn. Lawson's first task was to interview Franklin, the man who had found Lucia. His shock and confusion were evident as he recounted his discovery, his voice shaking as he described how he had stumbled upon her in the morning mist. His account provided no answers, only confirming that Lucia had been placed here, likely sometime during the night, and had gone unnoticed until dawn. The timing of the storm had covered any traces of the killer's presence, washing away potential footprints or tire tracks, leaving Detective Lawson and her team with only the scene as it was. As word of Lucia's death spread, the town of Westfield was thrown into a state of mourning and confusion. Families gathered, whispering over morning coffee, trying to comprehend the horrifying news. Lucia had been a beloved figure, her life a model of devotion and kindness. Her death felt incomprehensible. At church services that Sunday, Father Gabriel Monroe led the congregation in prayer for her soul, his voice steady yet hollow, as if the weight of his own secrets threatened to betray him. The investigation ramped up swiftly. Detective Lawson began with the people closest to Lucia, her husband, David, who seemed shell-shocked as he answered her questions. David described how Lucia had seemed distant and troubled in recent months but admitted he hadn't known why. He insisted that he had no enemies, and to his knowledge, neither did Lucia. She was loved by everyone, he claimed, his voice breaking as he spoke. But as sincere as he appeared, Lawson knew that grief often had layers. She would keep David under close scrutiny. The next person Lawson questioned was Father Gabriel, whom she knew had a close relationship with Lucia. The priest was somber, his face pale as he spoke about the tragedy. He claimed that he had only offered her spiritual guidance, that she had come to him with worries about her family and personal struggles. She was a kind soul, he said, his voice low and measured. She wanted peace and understanding. But Lawson noticed the slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes drifted away when he spoke about Lucia, as though hiding something. The priest's reaction raised her suspicions, though there was nothing concrete to connect him to the crime. For now, he was just one of many people she would keep an eye on. Determined to uncover more about Lucia's life in the weeks leading up to her death, Lawson instructed her team to go through her phone records and search her home for anything that could provide insight into her state of mind. Within days, they discovered something unexpected, a hidden journal in her dresser. The journal was filled with entries that painted a picture of a woman who had been carrying deep burdens, a woman torn between duty and desire. As Lawson read through the pages, a narrative emerged that hinted at more than just personal struggles. In the journal, Lucia had written about a connection with someone who had once brought her comfort but now filled her with regret and guilt. She wrote about her inner turmoil, describing feelings of isolation and despair. The entries became more desperate, more scattered, as she recounted the loss of something precious, though she never specified what it was. The more Lawson read, the more she sensed that Lucia had been involved in something deeply personal, something that may have led her down a dangerous path. The phone records soon provided another lead. Numerous calls and messages had been exchanged between Lucia and a single number, one that matched Father Gabriel's. The frequency of the messages, their timing, often late at night, after the church's evening services, raised immediate red flags. The content was mostly innocuous, brief exchanges about meeting times and places, but the volume suggested an intimacy that went beyond standard pastoral guidance. Detective Lawson felt a chill run down her spine. What if the person Lucia had written about in her journal, the one who had once brought her comfort, was Gabriel himself? She knew she was working on a hunch, but something about Gabriel's calm yet distant manner unsettled her. His involvement with Lucia, whatever the nature of it, was more than what he had initially let on. And as the details began to align, the lines of suspicion grew darker. With the discovery of Lucia's journal and the mysterious relationship hinted at in her phone records, Lawson felt she was getting closer to understanding the truth. This was no random act of violence, no misfortune of circumstance. Lucia's death was connected to her hidden struggles, to her inner turmoil, and perhaps to a dangerous secret shared with someone she had once trusted deeply. Determined to uncover the full extent of Lucia's connections, Detective Lawson began to piece together the final days of her life. The secrets, the unanswered questions, and the potential scandal brewing beneath Westfield's quiet surface left her with one certainty: Lucia's death was just the beginning. Detective Sarah Lawson pored over every detail of Lucia Harper's life in the days following the discovery of her body. With each passing day, she became more convinced that Lucia's death was no accident of fate, but rather the consequence of secrets buried deep beneath Westfield's quiet surface. The initial findings from Lucia's journal and her phone records were pieces of a puzzle that hinted at a hidden relationship, a clandestine connection that had left traces for those keen enough to find them. Determined to unearth the truth, Lawson focused her attention on Father Gabriel Monroe. Her instincts told her that his relationship with Lucia was more than spiritual guidance, it had the markings of something personal, intense, and dangerous. The text messages and frequent calls suggested an intimacy far beyond what was typical between a priest and a parishioner. Each message, though seemingly innocuous, was laced with subtext, and the volume and timing of their exchanges hinted at private meetings. Intrigued, Lawson obtained permission to dig deeper into Father Gabriel's phone records and personal schedule, looking for patterns that might connect him to Lucia's last days. What she found was subtle yet damning. Gabriel and Lucia had been in contact almost daily, sometimes multiple times a day, often at odd hours or just after the church's evening services. Even more suspicious, the messages had ceased completely in the days leading up to Lucia's death, a pattern Lawson recognized from countless cases before. This abrupt silence hinted at a falling out, a confrontation, or perhaps a final decision. Bolstered by these findings, Lawson instructed her team to search Lucia's home and personal belongings more thoroughly. As they combed through her room, they found something telling, a small, worn note tucked inside her Bible, written in Lucia's delicate handwriting. It was brief, only a few lines, but the words were powerful. I can't keep pretending. I can't live in shadows anymore. This has to end. Lawson's pulse quickened as she read it. Lucia's resolve to bring something to light, to end whatever she was hiding, was clear. The note suggested a decision to expose her relationship with Gabriel, one that may have led to her death. The next step was confronting Gabriel again. This time, Lawson prepared herself, armed with the new evidence and her suspicions. She called him into the station, framing it as a routine follow-up. Gabriel arrived, his demeanor composed but strained, his usual calm presence overshadowed by an edge of tension. He sat across from her in the sterile interview room, his gaze focused, his hands clasped tightly on the table. Father Monroe, Lawson began, her tone cool and professional, I wanted to go over some details that have come up in our investigation. In particular, your relationship with Lucia Harper. Gabriel's eyes flickered, a brief glint of alarm quickly masked by a forced composure. As I said before, Detective, my relationship with Lucia was purely pastoral. She was a troubled woman, and I was simply trying to help her through a difficult time. Lawson nodded, but she wasn't buying his story. I understand that. But the frequency of your communication, the number of calls and texts, and the late hours, it's more than what most people would consider pastoral care, wouldn't you agree? Gabriel's grip tightened on his hands, his knuckles whitening as he forced a smile. Lucia needed guidance, Detective. She was struggling, and as her priest, it was my duty to support her. Support her? Lawson's voice grew sharper, leaning into her suspicions. Father, we found a journal in Lucia's home. She describes feeling torn, isolated, and burdened by a relationship she could no longer continue in silence. It seems like she was preparing to end things, perhaps even go public. Does that sound familiar to you? Gabriel's composure cracked, a flicker of fear shadowing his face before he quickly regained control. Detective, I don't know what she wrote in her journal, but I can assure you. Lawson cut him off. Father, we also found a note she wrote shortly before her death. She wrote, this has to end. Whatever the nature of your relationship, it wasn't as simple as pastoral care. You're hiding something. Gabriel's silence was telling. His face grew pale, his gaze shifting downward as he struggled to maintain his facade. The walls were closing in, and he knew it. After a long moment, he looked up, his expression a mixture of resignation and defensiveness. Yes, he admitted finally, his voice a barely audible whisper. Lucia and I, we had a connection. But it was complicated. She was lost, looking for something, and I wanted to help her. I didn't realize it would come to this. Lawson leaned forward, her tone probing. What exactly do you mean by connection? Were you having an affair? Gabriel hesitated, his jaw clenched. It wasn't supposed to happen, Detective. I tried to end it, to steer her back to her family, but she insisted. She wanted more. His words, however vague, confirmed Lawson's suspicions. She saw through his attempts to deflect blame, recognizing a desperation to control the narrative. But something darker lingered behind his words, a hint of contempt mixed with resentment. Whatever had happened between them had turned volatile, and Gabriel, once her confidant, had become someone Lucia could no longer trust. Pressing on, Lawson asked, did Lucia threaten to expose the relationship? Gabriel's expression hardened. She was talking about going public, yes. She thought it was necessary, that it would help her find peace. I tried to tell her it would ruin us both. But she wouldn't listen. Lawson observed him closely, noting the anger flashing in his eyes, the bitterness in his tone. This was not the regret of a man mourning a loss, this was the frustration of someone who felt cornered, betrayed by a woman who had once been his solace. In that moment, Lawson knew she was looking at more than just a guilty man, she was looking at someone who had likely felt justified in silencing Lucia. As she wrapped up the interview, Lawson was certain she had enough to keep Gabriel under suspicion. His words, his expressions, the hidden relationship, everything pointed to a motive rooted in desperation, a desire to protect his reputation at all costs. But she knew she needed one more thing to solidify her case. Lawson requested forensic analysis of Gabriel's phone location records, hoping to place him near the field on the night of Lucia's death. If he had been there, she would have what she needed to tie him directly to the crime. As the evidence mounted, the web of secrets and lies that Gabriel and Lucia had spun was unraveling, leaving behind a trail that led straight to betrayal and murder. In the days that followed, as the investigation gained momentum, Westfield's quiet streets buzzed with rumors and whispers. The beloved priest, once viewed as the town's moral compass, was now tainted with suspicion. Detective Lawson had her sights set on the truth, and with each discovery, she was drawing closer to exposing the secrets that had claimed Lucia Harper's life. Detective Sarah Lawson returned to the station with a renewed sense of purpose. The pieces of the puzzle were aligning, Gabriel's evasive behavior, his cryptic admissions, and the chilling words Lucia had left behind in her journal. She knew there was more to uncover, and Gabriel's calm exterior was beginning to fracture. Lawson prepared herself to press him further, to break through the carefully constructed wall of control he had built around himself. That evening, Lawson summoned Gabriel for an official interrogation. This time, there was no polite pretense, no casual conversation. Gabriel walked into the room, his face pale and drawn, his composure visibly weakened. He seemed smaller, as though the weight of his secrets was finally beginning to crush him. Lawson watched him carefully as he took a seat, her gaze unwavering as she set her file down on the table. "Father Monroe," she began, her voice steady but pointed, "we've uncovered a lot since the last time we spoke. I think it's time for you to tell us the full truth about your relationship with Lucia Harper and what really happened the night she died." Gabriel's face hardened, his hands clenched together on the table. "Detective," he said, his voice measured, "I've already explained our relationship. I was trying to help her. She was troubled, and I offered her guidance." Lawson's expression remained impassive. "Guidance," she repeated, her tone dripping with skepticism. "Father, the evidence suggests something far more personal. We know about the constant communication, the late-night calls, the secret meetings. This wasn't guidance, it was an affair. One that ended with her dead in a field outside of town." Gabriel's jaw tightened, his composure slipping further. He shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the corners of the room as though seeking an escape. But Lawson wasn't about to let him off the hook. She continued, her voice cutting through his silence. "We have her journal, Father," she pressed. "Lucia wrote about her conflict, her guilt, and her desire to end things. She was ready to reveal everything, wasn't she? To come clean to her husband, to the congregation. That was a threat to you, wasn't it?" Gabriel exhaled sharply, his mask of calm finally shattering. "Lucia was impulsive," he muttered, his tone tinged with bitterness. "She thought she could just expose us, as if there would be no consequences. She didn't understand what that would do to me, to my role here, to everything I've built." Lawson leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "So you decided to stop her? Silence her before she could destroy your reputation?" Gabriel's eyes flashed with anger. "I didn't kill her," he spat, his voice rising defensively. "Yes, we were involved. Yes, it was a mistake, a lapse in judgment. But I would never. I didn't want her dead." Lawson held his gaze, unflinching. "Then why were you in contact with her so frequently before she died? And why, Father, did you stop communicating with her completely in the days leading up to her death?" Gabriel's silence was damning. His hands trembled slightly as he struggled to compose himself, but the calm facade he had once worn with ease was gone, replaced by fear and desperation. Lawson could see the cracks forming, the truth seeping out between his carefully chosen words. As the interrogation continued, Lawson received a signal from her team outside the room. They had uncovered another piece of evidence, surveillance footage from a gas station located on the edge of town, just a few miles from the field where Lucia's body was found. The footage captured a car matching Gabriel's make and model driving toward the field late at night, on the evening of Lucia's death. Lawson leaned back, a sense of satisfaction settling over her. She placed a still image from the footage in front of Gabriel, watching his face as he looked down at it. His expression shifted, panic flashing in his eyes as he recognized the evidence for what it was, a direct link between him and the scene of the crime. "Care to explain this, Father?" Lawson's voice was sharp, cutting through the silence. "Your car, on the road to the field, late at night. You told us you hadn't seen Lucia in days. But the evidence tells a different story." Gabriel's face drained of color, his hands now visibly shaking. I went for a drive," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. I needed to clear my head." Lawson raised an eyebrow, her skepticism evident. "Clear your head? Near the very field where Lucia's body was found? That's quite a coincidence, don't you think?" He said nothing, his gaze fixed on the table, his shoulders slumping as the weight of the evidence bore down on him. Lawson knew she had him cornered, but she wanted him to confess, to admit the truth that lingered in every uneasy glance and unsteady breath. "We also have fingerprints from the back door of the Harper residence, Gabriel," she continued, her voice unwavering. "They match yours. The door through which Lucia left her home the night she died. It seems you were in more places than you admitted to, Father." Gabriel's head snapped up, his face a mixture of fear and fury. "Lucia, she wanted to talk. I tried to tell her it would ruin us both, that we had to keep it quiet, but she wouldn't listen. She was reckless, wanting to confess everything as if her honesty would somehow bring her peace." Lawson finished his sentence, her tone hardened. "And you, Gabriel, you couldn't let that happen. Not when her truth could expose you and destroy everything you held dear." The room was silent, the tension thick and oppressive. Gabriel's face crumbled, the defiance in his eyes giving way to a resignation that seemed to settle over him like a heavy shroud. Lawson watched as the realization of his defeat dawned on him, his shoulders sagging as he finally broke under the weight of his lies. After a long pause, he spoke, his voice hollow and defeated. "She was going to ruin everything," he muttered, more to himself than to Lawson. "I just wanted it to stop." Lawson stood, her expression unreadable as she gathered her notes. "You've just admitted more than you realize, Father," she said, her tone cold. "We'll be going through every detail of your statement, every piece of evidence. If you have any remaining shred of truth to tell, now would be the time." Gabriel looked up at her, his face a mix of desperation and despair, but he remained silent, his gaze dropping once more to the table. As Lawson left the room, she knew that the case was all but closed. The evidence, the surveillance footage, and now Gabriel's fractured admissions painted a damning picture. His secrets, buried for so long, had finally come to light, and the consequences of his betrayal were about to catch up with him. In the end, the priest who had once inspired trust and admiration would face the judgment of both the law and the community he had betrayed. And for Lucia Harper, whose life had been consumed by a love that turned deadly, justice was finally within reach. The courtroom was packed to capacity on the opening day of Father Gabriel Monroe's trial, a palpable tension hanging in the air. Westfield's residents, once fiercely devoted to Gabriel, now stared at him with expressions of shock, betrayal, and anger. Word of the scandal had spread far and wide, drawing journalists, townspeople, and Lucia Harper's grieving family members, all desperate to see justice served for the life that had been taken so senselessly. Gabriel, sitting at the defense table, looked nothing like the man who had once commanded respect from the pulpit. He was pale, his shoulders hunched, his gaze fixed downward as if he couldn't bear to look at anyone in the room. The charismatic confidence he had once exuded was gone, replaced by a hollow, defeated man, haunted by his own actions. The prosecutor, District Attorney Amanda Griffin, wasted no time painting a picture of Gabriel's descent from respected priest to murderer. Her voice was steady, almost chilling, as she addressed the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a case about betrayal, manipulation, and the lengths to which one man was willing to go to protect his secrets. Father Gabriel Monroe abused his power and violated the trust of this community. He led Lucia Harper into a forbidden relationship, and when she threatened to expose him, he silenced her, permanently. The first pieces of evidence presented were Lucia's journal entries, detailing her internal struggles, the illicit relationship, and her resolve to end the secrecy. The prosecutor read passages aloud, each word casting a chilling silence over the courtroom. Lucia's voice echoed through the pages, a testament to her vulnerability, her turmoil, and ultimately, her resolve to reclaim her life, even if it meant risking everything. The jury sat transfixed, unable to look away from the picture her words painted of a woman trapped, manipulated, and ultimately betrayed. Gabriel's defense attorney, Richard Palmer, a seasoned and composed figure, attempted to counter the damning evidence. He argued that while Gabriel had indeed made grievous errors in judgment, there was no definitive proof that he had committed murder. He painted Lucia as a troubled woman, emotionally fragile, and suggested that her death might have been the result of an accident or the actions of another party. Father Gabriel is guilty of many things, Palmer admitted, addressing the jury. But murder is not one of them. There is no hard evidence, no witness, no forensic proof, tying my client directly to Lucia's tragic death. But the prosecution was ready. District Attorney Griffin moved on to the surveillance footage from the gas station near the field where Lucia's body had been found. The grainy video showed Gabriel's car heading toward the scene on the night of the murder. Pausing the footage, Griffin addressed the jury. This footage places Father Gabriel Monroe in the vicinity of the crime scene at the time of Lucia Harper's death, Griffin said, her voice steely. He told investigators he was nowhere near Lucia that night, but the evidence tells a different story. His alibi has holes, and this footage proves he had both motive and opportunity. Next came the testimony of Detective Sarah Lawson, who took the stand with confidence. She recounted her interviews with Gabriel, his evasive responses, and the evidence gathered from both Lucia's and Gabriel's phone records. Father Gabriel's phone records show a suspicious pattern of communication, including late-night calls and meetings. Then, in the days leading up to her death, his contact with Lucia abruptly ceased. This was not a coincidence. This was a deliberate silence. Griffin moved on to the fingerprint evidence, connecting Gabriel to the back door of the Harper residence. Though the defense tried to argue that his fingerprints could have been from an earlier visit, Griffin was quick to point out that the prints were found on the door handle Lucia would have used to leave her home on the night of her death. This was no ordinary visit, she emphasized. Gabriel was there, and he was the last person to see Lucia alive. Gabriel's defense scrambled to find witnesses to testify to his character, calling on parishioners who spoke of his years of service, his dedication to the church, and his kindness. But each testimony felt hollow, as though the words lacked conviction, tainted by the knowledge of the betrayal that Gabriel's actions had inflicted upon the community. Even his once steadfast supporters struggled to defend him, their voices wavering as they described the man they thought they knew. When it was time for Gabriel to take the stand, he looked worn, his face shadowed with regret. He maintained his innocence, denying that he had ever intended harm to Lucia. "I loved her in my own way," he confessed, his voice choked. "But I was never capable of hurting her. I only wanted to help her find peace." But Griffin was relentless, pressing him on the inconsistencies in his statements, the surveillance footage, and the damning phone records. Each question chipped away at his defense, exposing the contradictions and desperation behind his words. Under the unyielding scrutiny, Gabriel's facade of innocence began to crumble. His voice wavered, his hands shook, and the cracks in his story grew ever wider. The most emotional moment of the trial came when David Harper, Lucia's husband, took the stand. His voice was filled with grief as he recounted the night he learned of his wife's death, his disbelief at discovering the affair, and the overwhelming loss that had turned his life upside down. "Lucia was the heart of our family," he said, his voice breaking. "We may have had our troubles, but she was a good woman, a good mother. She didn't deserve this." His words resonated with the jury and the spectators alike, a poignant reminder of the life that had been stolen. David's testimony cast a shadow over Gabriel's defense, leaving little room for sympathy as he described the impact Lucia's death had on him and their children. The betrayal, the pain, and the sense of injustice were etched in every line of his face, and the jury watched, visibly moved. After days of compelling testimony, damning evidence, and the harrowing stories of lives torn apart, the jury was sent to deliberate. The tension in the courtroom was thick as everyone waited, the weight of the community's collective sorrow hanging heavy in the air. It took less than a day for the jury to reach a verdict. When they returned, the courtroom fell into a hushed silence. The foreperson rose, reading from the slip of paper in her hands, her voice unwavering. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Father Gabriel Monroe, guilty of murder in the first degree." A murmur rippled through the room as gasps and whispers filled the air. Gabriel's face went white, his body slumping in defeat. The sentence was pronounced, life in prison without the possibility of parole. The once revered priest, who had held so much power in the lives of his parishioners, was now condemned to a life in confinement, his secrets exposed, his reputation forever shattered. The community left the courtroom that day changed, each person grappling with the betrayal of a man they had once trusted. Lucia Harper's family, though burdened by their loss, found a semblance of closure in the verdict. Justice had been served, but the pain of losing her lingered, a wound that would never fully heal. As the news spread through Westfield, the story of Father Gabriel's downfall became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the darkness that could hide behind even the most trusted faces. The community would carry the scars of Lucia's death, haunted by the knowledge of the betrayal that had unfolded in their midst. For years to come, her story would remain a solemn lesson in the fragile nature of trust and the devastating consequences of secrets. In the weeks following the trial, Westfield tried to return to normalcy, but the town had been irrevocably changed. The scandal surrounding Father Gabriel Monroe had left a wound that would not easily heal. The trusted figure who had once symbolized guidance and stability had been exposed as a man capable of deception, betrayal, and ultimately, murder. For the residents of Westfield, there was no escaping the shadow his actions had cast over the community. Lucia Harper's family struggled to move on, her absence leaving a void that felt impossible to fill. David Harper, haunted by the memories of his wife and the secrets she had kept, withdrew into a quiet life with their children. He tried to preserve some sense of normalcy for them, taking comfort in routine and in the small moments that kept them connected to the memory of their mother. For David, though the trial had brought a sense of justice, there was no closure. Lucia's betrayal still hung heavily in his heart, mingled with the sorrow of her untimely death. Each evening, after putting the children to bed, David found himself drawn to the last place where he felt closest to Lucia, their family garden. He would sit there, lost in thought, surrounded by the flowers Lucia had once tended to with such care. The pain lingered, the betrayal sharp and unyielding, but in those quiet moments, he held on to the memory of the woman he had loved, the life they had shared before it all fell apart. The congregation of St. Mary's, once united by a shared faith, now found itself divided. Parishioners struggled to reconcile the image of the priest who had led them with the reality of the man who had manipulated one of their own into a deadly affair. Attendance at the church dwindled as people grappled with a loss of trust, unable to separate their spiritual beliefs from the moral failings of their former leader. The whispers and quiet conversations that filled the pews each Sunday grew louder as the town debated the future of the parish. In the aftermath of the trial, the diocese dispatched a new priest to St. Mary's. Father Thomas O'Connell, a quiet and compassionate man, arrived with the unenviable task of mending a broken community. He extended kindness and patience to the congregation, listening to their concerns and helping them process the lingering grief and betrayal. Slowly, with each sermon, each gentle reassurance, he began to rebuild the fractured trust, though he knew the scars left by Father Gabriel's actions would remain for years to come. For Detective Sarah Lawson, the case had left an indelible mark on her as well. Though she had successfully brought justice to Lucia's memory, she couldn't escape the feeling that something essential had been lost in the process. She had seen firsthand how trust, once broken, could unravel the bonds between people. The case haunted her, a constant reminder of the fragility of human nature and the ease with which moral boundaries could be crossed. In quiet moments, she reflected on Lucia's life, on the choices that had led to her tragic end. Lucia's story, though tragic, was a reminder to Lawson of the power of unresolved emotions, the hidden despair that could push someone toward irreversible decisions. In her heart, Lawson held a quiet resolve to honor Lucia's memory by serving with renewed dedication. She knew she couldn't change the past, but she could continue seeking justice for others who might one day find themselves entangled in similar, tragic circumstances. As the seasons turned and the first snow of winter blanketed Westfield, the community found itself in a state of quiet reflection. People spoke less of Gabriel's betrayal and more of the lessons they had taken from his downfall. Parents became more mindful of the conversations they had with their children, urging them to seek honesty and strength in their relationships. Couples reassessed their bonds, the story of Lucia and Gabriel serving as a stark reminder of what could happen when trust was eroded and secrets were allowed to fester in silence. Though the town would never fully forget the events that had unfolded, life began to resume a familiar rhythm. Shops opened, children played in the parks, and laughter returned to the community. Yet, underneath the everyday routines, there was a new resilience, a quiet understanding that they were stronger now, bound not just by shared experiences but by a collective determination to rebuild their lives with transparency and compassion. Westfield would always carry the memory of Lucia Harper and the scandal that had shaken its foundations. Her story, though dark, became a part of the town's identity, a tale shared in whispers as a reminder of the dangers of secrecy and the high cost of deception. The betrayal, the tragedy, and the eventual pursuit of justice became woven into the fabric of the town, a haunting yet unifying chapter in its history. As years passed, Lucia's name became a symbol of resilience, and Gabriel's fall from grace a cautionary tale. The community moved forward, forever changed but stronger, having confronted the darkness within its midst and emerged with a new commitment to truth. In time, Lucia's children grew up with the knowledge of their mother's strength and her struggles, learning from the lessons of her life and carrying forward her legacy of love and resilience.